They forced her to marry the man the village pitied. They called him broken. They called him unfortunate. They called him, behind cupped hands and in voices meant to carry, the cripple who could barely walk and would certainly never provide. They had no idea who they were pitying. Welcome to Visa's Tales. If you are new here, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss a story. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into it. The morning of the wedding, Rokhaya sat in front of the small mirror in her mother's room, while her mother worked the comb through her hair with hands that were trying very hard not to shake. Neither of them spoke about what was happening. They had spoken about it enough in the weeks before. There was nothing left to say that would change it, and both of them had reached, separately, the particular exhaustion that comes after you have argued about something as far as arguing can take you, and the thing is going to happen anyway. Outside, in the yard, Rokhaya could hear her father's voice, low, instructing someone about the arrangement of chairs, the number of mats, the timing of the meal. He had been speaking in that voice for 3 days. It was the voice he used when he needed to sound like a man who was in control of something. He was not, in any way that mattered, in control of anything. 6 months earlier, Baba Aliaun had been one of the more respected men in the village. Not wealthy exactly, but comfortable, a man with land and a reputation for fair dealing that had taken him 30 years to build. He had entered into a business arrangement with a trader from the regional town, a man named Coulibaly, who had talked persuasively about a warehousing venture that would triple the family's modest savings within 2 years. The venture had not tripled anything. Coulibaly had disappeared with the investment, the land that had been used as collateral, and a signature Baba Aliaun had been too proud to have properly reviewed before he signed it. By the time the truth of it settled over the village, as truth always did, carried by the same current that carried everything else, Baba Aliaun had gone from a man other men consulted to a man other men discussed. The land was gone. A portion of the savings that remained had gone to a lawyer who had ultimately been unable to help. And the family's name, which had been the one thing Baba Aliaun had always assumed could not be taken from him, had been taken from him anyway, piece by piece, in the quiet arithmetic of village opinion. He had needed badly to be seen doing something that looked like humility, something that would signal to the village that the family understood its place now, that it was not still pretending to a standing it no longer had. The marriage had presented itself as exactly that signal. It had not been Baba Aliaun's idea precisely. An intermediary, an elder named Madhu who kept a foot in every household's business, had come to him 3 months after the collapse with a proposal from the household of Thierno, the quiet man who lived alone at the edge of the village in his late mother's house. Baba Aliaun's first reaction had been something close to insult. Thierno's household was, by every visible measure, poorer than his own remained even after the collapse. The man himself was rarely seen in the market, walked with a rumored unsteadiness that the village had turned into folklore over several years of imprecise storytelling, and had no family standing to speak of beyond the memory of a mother who had died some years back and a father nobody in the current generation remembered clearly. Madhu had come on a Thursday evening, while Baba Aliaun was still sitting with the ledgers that no longer added up to anything he could live with, and had taken a seat without being invited to, which was itself a kind of statement about how far Baba Aliaun's standing had fallen. A man people had once waited to be invited to sit in front of now had elders inviting themselves. There is a household, Madhu had said, that wishes to propose a match for your daughter. Baba Aliaun had asked warily which household. Madhu had told him, and Baba Aliaun had laughed. Not unkindly, but with the specific bitterness of a man who has just been offered confirmation of exactly how far he has fallen. The cripple, he had said. You come to me about the cripple. Madhu had not flinched at the word, though something in his expression had suggested he found it unnecessary. He is not asking for anything, Madhu had said. No dowry beyond what tradition requires. No demands. He is asking only for the marriage itself. Madhu had been patient through the rest of the conversation, and persistent, and it was that single sentence, no demands, only the marriage itself, that changed Baba Aliaun's mind. Not because it was persuasive in the way Madhu intended, but because Baba Aliaun heard in it exactly the confirmation of his own diminishment that he had been dreading, and had decided, in his exhaustion, to simply accept. Baba Aliaun had understood this, incorrectly, as evidence that even a man with almost nothing considered this an opportunity, that his daughter's hand, once sought by families of real standing, had fallen to a level where even the village's most pitted household felt itself fortunate to receive it. He had said yes out of exhaustion and shame in equal measure. He had never once considered that Thierno had asked for nothing because Thierno needed nothing, and that the absence of a demand was not the mark of a man grateful for scraps but the mark of a man who had specifically, deliberately, wanted this particular alliance and no other terms attached to it. Rokhaya knew none of this reasoning. She knew only the outcome. She knew that she was 26 years old and had once imagined a different kind of life, and that the life in front of her now had been decided by other people for reasons that had very little to do with her. She had met Thierno exactly twice before the wedding, both times at the formal visits required by custom, both times with a room full of relatives present, both times with almost no opportunity for either of them to say anything beyond the scripted courtesies the occasion demanded. She remembered him faintly from childhood. He had lived in the village briefly years ago before his family moved for his father's work, and had returned some years later after both his parents had died, quiet and mostly kept to himself since. She remembered a serious boy who read constantly and did not participate much in the games of the other children. Not from unfriendliness, she thought, but from a kind of self-containment that even as a child had seemed complete. She did not remember anything about a limp, though the village certainly discussed his walk now, in the specific tone people used for things they found simultaneously pitiable and slightly entertaining. Her mother finished with her hair. She turned Rokhaya gently by the shoulders to face the mirror. "You are beautiful." It was not a comfort exactly. It was simply true, and her mother said true things, even on days when true things did not help very much. Rokhaya looked at her reflection. "Do you think he is unkind?" Her mother considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I do not know what he is. I know your father is desperate and desperate men do not always choose well." A pause. "But I also know that desperate men sometimes stumble into the right thing by accident, because they have stopped being careful enough to ruin it." Rokhaya did not find this especially reassuring. Her younger sister Fatou appeared in the doorway, 17 and entirely unable to keep her opinions to herself, which Rokhaya had always found both exhausting and, in moments like this one, strangely necessary. "Madame Sar is already outside, telling anyone who will listen that this is what happens to families who forget their place." Rokhaya closed her eyes briefly. Fatou came and sat on the edge of the bed. Her performance of disdain faded slightly. "Are you frightened?" Rokhaya thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. "I am tired. That is different from frightened. I have been frightened for 3 months. Today I am just tired." Fatou took her hand. The morning wore on. Relatives arrived in the slow trickle typical of village occasions, greeting Rokhaya's mother with the particular blend of sympathy and curiosity that had become the family's constant companion since the collapse. Some of them meant the sympathy. Others wore it the way you wear a borrowed garment, correctly but without any real fit. By midday, the yard had filled enough that the ceremony could reasonably begin, though filled was a generous word for what would have been, 18 months earlier, a gathering 3 times the size, with musicians and enough food that people spoke about it for a season afterward. Baba Aliaun had once hosted a naming ceremony for a nephew that the village still referenced as a standard other families tried to match. Nobody would be referencing this wedding as a standard for anything, except perhaps as a cautionary tale, which Rokhaya understood without anyone needing to say it directly. The ceremony was small, as these things go when a family has fallen. No music beyond a single drummer who had agreed to come as a favor to Rokhaya's mother. No feast beyond what the 2 families could manage between them. No crowd beyond the required relatives and the neighbors who came out of a mixture of obligation and curiosity, the specific curiosity of people who wanted to see for themselves exactly how far the once respected Aliaun family had fallen. Thierno arrived on foot, alone, in a simple but well-made shirt that Rokhaya noticed without understanding why she noticed it. It was not expensive looking exactly, but it fit him properly, in the way clothes fit a man whose clothes had been made for him rather than bought to approximately the right size. He walked with a very slight favor of one leg. It was, she thought, watching him cross the yard, considerably less pronounced than 3 years of village description had led her to expect. She had been braced, without fully admitting it to herself, for something more dramatic. A cane, an obvious struggle. What she saw instead was a man walking at a completely normal pace with the faintest asymmetry in his gait. the kind of thing you might not notice at all if nobody had told you to look for it. He greeted her father with the correct courtesies. He greeted her mother with warmth that seemed, to Rokaya's practiced eye for insincerity, entirely genuine. He turned to Rokaya last, and for a moment, before the ceremony's formal structure took over, he looked at her directly. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for the way this has happened. It should not have felt like a sentence." She had not expected an apology. She had expected, if anything, awkwardness or an attempt at false cheer. And yet here we are. Here we are, he agreed. The ceremony proceeded. The vows were exchanged. Madame Sar, positioned at the edge of the gathering with two other women of similar temperament, made a comment loud enough to be heard by exactly the people it was meant to be heard by. Something about beggars and choosers, delivered with a smile that made the cruelty of it somehow worse than if she had simply scowled. Rokaya heard it. She saw Thierno hear it too. His expression did not change. He simply continued through the ceremony with the same quiet composure he had carried since he arrived, and something about that composure, the refusal to let Madame Sar's cruelty land anywhere visible, struck Rokaya as either extraordinary self-control or the specific numbness of a man who had heard this particular cruelty so many times it had stopped reaching him. She did not yet know which. That night, after the small gathering had dispersed and Rokaya had been brought to Thierno's house at the edge of the village. Modest, well-kept, smaller than her family's own house but clean in a way that suggested real care rather than mere adequacy. A car arrived. It was late, past the hour when anyone in the village would normally expect visitors. Rokaya was in the front room, still in her wedding clothes, uncertain of the house's rhythms, when she heard the engine. She looked through the window. The car was not like any vehicle that came through the village with any regularity. It was dark, clean in a way that suggested it had never carried produce or livestock or the ordinary cargo of village life, and it moved with the particular quiet of an engine that had been well maintained rather than merely functional. A man got out, young, in plain but neat clothes, carrying two boxes that he brought to the side door without being asked where to take them, as though he had done this before. Thierno met him at the door. Rokaya, from the front room, could hear most of the exchange. "Everything is here, sir. The supplies from the—" He stopped himself. "From the market," he corrected. "Thank you, Ibrahima." Thierno's voice carried a note of mild reproach, gentle rather than sharp. "Sorry, sir. Old habit." He left quickly after that. Rokaya watched the car pull away into the dark, its lights cutting a clean line down the road that led eventually, she assumed, back toward the regional town and whatever lay beyond it. She did not ask Thierno about it that night. She was too tired, and it was too soon, and there was a version of the evening's strangeness that she filed away simply as one more thing about her new circumstances that did not yet make sense. But she remembered the word sir. She remembered the way Ibrahima had corrected himself about the market. She remembered that the car had been very clean, and very new, and had made almost no sound at all. She was not sure yet what any of it meant. She was fairly sure it meant something. The weeks that followed were not what Rokaya had prepared herself for. She had prepared, over the 3 months of dread leading up to the wedding, for hardship, for a house that struggled, for meals that required careful stretching, for the specific daily arithmetic of genuine poverty that she had watched other village families manage with varying degrees of grace. She had prepared herself to be brave about it, to not let her family's disgrace show on her face when neighbors came to see how she was managing. She did not need to be brave about hardship because there was very little hardship to be brave about. The house, while modest in appearance, was never short of anything. The kitchen was stocked with more variety than her own family's kitchen had managed even before the collapse. When a section of the roof began to leak in the second week, it was repaired within 2 days by workers who arrived, did careful and unhurried work, and left without any of the negotiating over price that such work usually required in the village. When Rokaya mentioned, almost in passing, that the well nearest the house ran low by the dry season and required a long walk to the next one, a team of men arrived within the month and dug a new well on the property itself. Clean, deep, properly lined. A project that would have cost more than most village families earned in 2 years, completed without announcement or apparent strain. There were smaller things too, things that took longer to add up to a pattern because each one, on its own, could be explained away. The mattress on their bed, replaced in the 3rd week after Rokaya mentioned, only once, that the old one had a broken spring that dug into her back. Replaced not with something adequate but with something genuinely good, the kind of mattress she had only ever encountered in the homes of the village's wealthiest families. The radio that appeared in the kitchen, unprompted, after she had mentioned missing the morning programs she used to listen to at her parents' house. The seamstress who arrived one afternoon, unannounced, with bolts of fabric Rokhaya had never seen for sale anywhere within a day's travel, saying only that she had been asked to make Rokhaya 2 new outfits and would return in a week for a fitting. Each of these things, individually, could be attributed to a careful man being thoughtful with limited resources. Together, over 6 weeks, they began to describe something that did not behave like limited resources at all. Rokhaya noticed all of this. She was not a careless observer of her own life, but she found herself, in those early weeks, more absorbed by something else entirely, the man she had married. Thierno was nothing like the village's caricature of him. He read constantly. She had never seen so many books in a private home, stacked with the specific organization of someone who used them rather than displayed them. He asked her questions and then, unusually for a man in her experience, actually listened to the answers, following up on details she had mentioned days earlier as though he had genuinely retained them because they mattered to him. He was funny in a dry, understated way that took her several days to properly notice, because his humor rarely announced itself as humor. He would say something with a completely level face and she would only realize a beat later that he had been making a joke the entire time. He did not perform kindness. He simply was kind, in the unglamorous daily way that mattered more than any grand gesture. Remembering that she preferred her tea a certain way, noticing when she was tired before she said so, giving her space without making the space feel like distance. She found herself, against every expectation she had carried into the marriage, looking forward to the parts of the day when they were simply in the same room. She did not tell anyone this. She was not yet certain what to do with it herself. There was an evening, in that same stretch of weeks, when a goat belonging to a neighboring family wandered into their small garden and destroyed most of a bed of vegetables Rokhaya had been tending since her 2nd week in the house. Nothing valuable in itself, but something she had planted with her own hands in a life that had otherwise been handed to her fully assembled, and she had felt the loss of it more sharply than the vegetables themselves justified. She had not said anything about it. She had simply stood at the edge of the ruined bed at dusk, arms crossed, saying nothing. Thierno had come to stand beside her. He had not asked what was wrong, which she noticed and appreciated, because she was not certain she could have explained it without sounding foolish over a handful of ruined greens. "We can replant it," he had said eventually. "Tomorrow if you want. Or we can build a fence around it properly this time so it does not happen again." "I know we can," she had said. "That is not really the thing." He had been quiet for a moment, looking at the same wrecked bed she was looking at. "I understand that too," he had said. "Sometimes the thing that is lost matters more than what it would cost to replace it." They had stood there together until the light went fully out of the sky, and the next morning, without being asked again, he had gone to a corner of the garden and begun digging post holes for a proper fence, working through the heat of the morning with the same unhurried, uncomplaining care he brought to everything, and had said nothing more about it, which she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world, not with grand gestures, but with the accumulation of small correct ones. It was around this same time that she began, without deciding to, comparing him against the man the village had described to her for 3 years before the wedding, and finding that the two men shared almost nothing beyond the mild unevenness of a walk that had never once, in her presence, slowed him down from doing anything he wanted to do. The village, meanwhile, had opinions. Madame Sar, who had made something of a project out of Rokhaya's marriage, took to stopping her at the market with expressions of exaggerated sympathy that were sympathy in nothing but name. "How are you managing, my dear?" Madame Sar said one morning, catching Rokhaya near the vegetable stalls. "It must be very difficult. Such an adjustment." Rokhaya, who had learned in 3 months of dealing with Madame Sar that direct honesty was the only response that actually ended these conversations quickly, answered simply, "I am managing very well, thank you." Madame Sar's smile tightened slightly, the tightening of someone who had wanted a different answer. Of course. You are being very brave about it." "I am not being brave about anything. There is nothing to be brave about." She walked on before Madame Sar could formulate a reply, which was, she had learned, the most satisfying way to end these exchanges. But the comments accumulated, as village comments do, into a kind of ambient pressure that Rokhaya found herself increasingly unwilling to simply absorb. She began to notice, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer performing acceptance of the marriage for her family's sake or endurance of it for her own pride. She was defending it because she had, somewhere in those weeks, begun to actually believe in it. She had not expected that. She was not certain Thierno knew it yet either. It was in the 6th week that she found the folder. She had not been looking for anything. She had been cleaning the small study Thierno used at the back of the house, a room she rarely entered, not because she was forbidden but because he worked there in the evenings and she had simply developed the habit of leaving him to it, and had found a drawer that did not close properly, the wood slightly swollen from the recent rains. She had opened it to see if she could fix the swelling, the kind of small practical problem she had grown up solving without thinking much about it, and found instead a folder held closed with a rubber band, thick with papers. She had not meant to look inside it. But the folder had shifted, and a page had slid partway out, and the letterhead at the top of the page had been visible before she made any conscious decision to read it. It was a company name she did not recognize. Bald Logistics and Agricultural Holdings. Beneath it, in smaller print, a registration number, an address in the regional capital, and language that was clearly financial figures with more zeros than she was used to seeing outside of the abstractions people used when discussing national budgets on the radio. She heard the front door. She put the folder back exactly as she had found it, closed the drawer as best she could, and was standing near the window with a cloth in her hand, pretending to have been dusting, when Thierno came into the study a moment later looking for something. He glanced at her. He glanced at the desk. Something in his expression suggested he had registered, in the way people register small disturbances in a familiar space, that something had been touched. He did not ask her about it. She did not mention it. But she thought about it for days afterward. The letterhead, the zeros, the unbranded car, the word sir that Ibrahima had used and immediately regretted. She began, without fully admitting to herself that she was doing it, to notice things she had previously let pass without examination. The quality of the fabric in Thierno's plain-looking clothes, the way he sometimes stepped outside to take a call on a phone she had never actually seen him use for anything else, the particular ease with which household problems that should have taken months to solve instead resolved themselves within days. She did not confront him. She was not certain, honestly, what she would even be confronting him about. A man having money he did not display was not, in itself, a wrong done to her. And there was a part of her, the part that had spent 6 weeks discovering that she genuinely liked this man, apart from everything else, that was afraid of what asking might change. So she waited, and she watched, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the waiting did not feel like suspicion. It felt like patience for something she trusted would eventually make sense. The gathering that Madame Sarr organized in the 9th week was framed, publicly, as a communal meeting to discuss the coming harvest season, the kind of practical assembly that villages held periodically and that carried no particular social weight beyond its stated purpose. Rokhaya understood, from the moment she saw the seating arrangement, that it was not really about the harvest. Her family had been seated, deliberately or not, near the back, a placement that in village terms carried a clear and unmistakable message. Madame Sarr, presiding from a position near the front with 2 of the village elders whose opinions she had spent months carefully cultivating, opened the meeting with the harvest business efficiently, almost perfunctorily, and then pivoted, with the smooth practiced ease of someone who had planned the pivot in advance, to a subject that had nothing to do with crops. We have seen, this season, addressing the gathering generally but looking directly at the section where Rokhaya's family sat. Families rise and families fall. It is not for us to judge too harshly. She paused for effect. But it is worth remembering, for the sake of our daughters, what happens when pride is not managed carefully. When a family reaches too high and falls too far, even a marriage to the village's most unfortunate son becomes the best available option. A ripple of reaction moved through the gathering. Some discomfort, some barely concealed amusement. The mixed response of a community that both disapproved of cruelty in principle and found it entertaining in practice. Rokhaya felt her father go very still beside her. She felt her mother's hand tighten on her arm, a silent instruction to let it pass, to not give Madame Sarr the reaction she was so transparently seeking. Rokhaya stood up anyway. She had not planned to. She would later be unable to fully explain, even to herself, the exact moment the decision formed. But she was standing, and the gathering had gone quiet in the way gatherings go quiet when something unexpected is about to happen, and she found that she had words ready that she had not consciously composed. "My husband is not unfortunate." Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "He is thoughtful and generous, and reads more books than anyone in this village, and has never once, in 9 weeks, spoken to me the way you have just spoken about him in front of 200 people. She looked at Madame Sarr directly. "I did not choose this marriage. That is true. But I would choose it now, today, if I were asked again. And I do not think there is a woman in this gathering who could say the same about her own marriage with as much certainty as I am saying it about mine." The silence that followed was total. Madame Sarr's expression moved through several configurations before settling on something that attempted dismissiveness and did not quite achieve it. Rokhaya sat back down. Her hands were shaking slightly, the shake of adrenaline rather than fear. Her mother's hand found hers and held it. She did not know at the time that Thierno had been standing at the edge of the gathering. He had come, as he occasionally did, to observe these community meetings without participating much, a habit the village had long since stopped remarking on. She did not know he had heard every word. She found out later from Fatou, who had watched him during the speech with the attentiveness of a 17-year-old who noticed everything and reported it with enthusiasm. He looked, Fatou reported, like a man who had just been told something he had needed to hear for a very long time and had stopped expecting to hear it at all. It was 4 days after the gathering that the visitor arrived. Rokhaya was at the market when it happened. A car, similar to the one that had come the night of the wedding, pulling up near the central square where a good portion of the village conducted its daily business. A man in a business shirt, clearly unfamiliar with village roads by the careful way he navigated the uneven ground, got out and asked, in a clear voice that carried further than he perhaps intended, for directions to Mr. Bald's residence. The name landed in the market the way a stone lands in still water. Several people turned. Madame Sarr, who happened to be present. Madame Sarr was, Rokhaya had come to understand, always somehow present for exactly the moments that would give her the most to discuss afterward, turned sharply enough that her head covering nearly slipped. "Bald?" someone asked. "Who is Bald?" The visitor, sensing he had said something that required clarification but not entirely understanding what, tried again. "Thierno Bald. I am here about the shipment delay at the port. His office said he was reachable here." He was directed, with considerable confusion, toward the edge of the village. Rokhaya, standing near enough to have heard the entire exchange, did not follow the crowd of curious onlookers who began, almost immediately, to drift in the same direction with the transparent innocence of people pretending they had somewhere else to be. She went home a different way, her heart moving faster than her feet, turning the name over. Thierno Bald. She reached the house perhaps 10 minutes after the visitor did. She found the man already leaving, satisfied apparently by whatever brief conversation had taken place, and Thierno standing in the doorway watching him go with the expression of a man whose careful arrangement has just come apart in a way he had hoped, for a while longer, to avoid. He saw her. Neither of them said anything immediately. The small crowd that had followed the visitor at a curious distance had stopped a respectful but very interested 20 meters away, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain the fiction that they were merely passing. "Come inside," he said quietly. She went inside. He closed the door. She stood in the front room, the same room where she had watched the car arrive on their wedding night, where she had first heard the word Surland wrong in Ibrahima's mouth, and looked at her husband, who was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite fear. Something closer to a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a long time and was not certain, yet, how his body would feel once the weight was gone. "I should have told you before this. I am sorry it happened like that, in front of half the village instead of for me properly at home. Tell me now." He told her. He told her about the accident, 3 years before she had known any of it was happening. A car that had rolled on the coastal road at night. A delivery run he had insisted on making himself because the regular driver was unwell, and he had not yet learned to trust anyone else with the company's early, fragile operations. He told her about waking up in a regional hospital with a leg that doctors had spoken about, in the first days, in the careful hedged language reserved for injuries they were not certain would heal well. He told her about the year that followed, months of learning to walk again, first with a frame, then a cane, then nothing but the habit of favoring one side that had simply never fully left him, though the doctors had eventually stopped being able to explain medically why it persisted at all. Some things the body kept long after the reason for keeping them had healed. He told her about lying in that hospital bed for the better part of 2 months with almost no visitors beyond Ibrahima, who had been a junior employee at the time and had simply kept showing up, and about deciding, somewhere in those long recovering weeks, that whatever life came after the accident was going to be built differently from the life before it. Smaller, quieter, harder to find. She listened to all of it without speaking, and when he described the limp, a limp that had been, in the early months, considerably worse than what remained of it now, she found herself reaching, without deciding to, for his hand. He told her about his father's small transport business, inherited after both his parents died, a modest operation moving goods between the regional towns that he had taken, in the years since the accident, years spent largely recovering, thinking, reading, and grown, carefully and without fanfare, into something considerably larger. Agricultural holdings. Logistics contracts across 3 regions. A company that now employed more people than lived in the entire village. Run from an office in the regional capital that he visited perhaps once a month. Managed the rest of the time through calls he took quietly, at a distance, in a life he had deliberately built to be small. I did not correct the village's assumptions about me, because for a long time after the accident, I did not want to be found by anyone who wanted something from me. Peace mattered more than being believed. A pause. I know how that sounds now. I am not certain it sounds better in my own defense than it does as an accusation. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing all of it. The money, the company, the years of careful invisibility. Then she said the thing that was actually sitting closest to the surface of what she felt, which had very little to do with any of it. Why me? Why this marriage? Madhu said you asked for it specifically. You did not need a wife who came with a family in disgrace. You could have had any woman in the region. Diurno was quiet for a moment. I remembered you, from before my family moved. You will not remember this, you were very young, I was not much older. But there was an afternoon when some of the other children took a toy from a smaller child and lied about it when the adults asked, and you were the only one who told the truth, even though telling the truth meant admitting you had been part of the group that took it. You did not have to say anything. Nobody would have known otherwise. You said it anyway. She stared at him. I have thought about that more than is probably reasonable for a memory that small. When I heard, years later, what had happened to your family, and how your father was arranging a marriage to manage the disgrace of it, I did not want you handed to someone who would treat you as a bargain, someone marrying beneath his own standing to feel briefly superior to a fallen family. He looked at her directly. I asked for the marriage because I remembered a girl who told the truth when lying would have been easier. I wanted to know if that girl was still in there. I did not want you to know who I was while I found out, because I did not want the answer to be about what I could give you. I wanted it to be about whether you and I, simply as 2 people, could actually build something. Rokhaya sat down slowly on the bench near the window. And what did you find? After 9 weeks. Diurno looked at her. I found her. Still in there. He said it simply, without decoration. Standing in front of 200 people. Telling the truth about a marriage nobody expected her to defend. Rokhaya put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying exactly, though close to it. The specific overwhelmed stillness of someone absorbing more truth in one afternoon than she had expected to absorb in a year. When she looked up, she said, You let the entire village call you broken for 3 years. I let them. Cost me very little and it protected me a great deal. Cost you something today. In front of everyone. He considered this. Yes. But I find, strangely, that I do not mind as much as I expected to. Outside, the small crowd that had followed the visitor was still lingering at a distance, now joined by several more curious neighbors who had heard second-hand and third-hand versions of the name Bald traveling through the village with the particular speed reserved for news that upends assumptions. Rokhaya looked toward the window, then back at her husband. They are going to talk about this for months. Yes, he agreed. Do you mind? He thought about it honestly, which she had come to recognize as his only way of answering anything. I mind less than I would have 3 years ago. I think that is because of you. The news moved through the village exactly as fast as Rokhaya had predicted, and considerably faster than Baba Aliaun was prepared for. He came to the house 2 days later, alone, in a state of visible distress that Rokhaya had not seen in him since the collapse of his own business arrangement. He stood in the front room where his daughter now lived a life he had entirely misunderstood, and he did not immediately know what to say. "I did not know." He said it finally. "I know you did not know. I arranged this marriage believing I was." He stopped, searching for a way to say it that did not indict himself entirely. "I believed I was accepting the only offer available to a family in disgrace. I did not know I was accepting an offer from—" He gestured somewhat helplessly at the house, the evidence of a life he had not understood. Thierno, who had been quietly present during the exchange, spoke for the first time. "You were not wrong to feel humbled, Baba Aliaun. Your family had fallen and you needed to be seen managing that honestly. Nothing about what you believed was foolish. You simply did not have all the information because I chose not to give it to you." Baba Aliaun looked at him for a long moment. Why let an old man believe his daughter's marriage was a mercy, when it was actually— He did not finish the sentence. "Because your shame was not about me. It was about what had happened to your name. Knowing what I had would not have restored that. It would only have changed who was offering the mercy, and I did not want you grateful to me. I wanted your daughter to have a real choice, made without either of us performing for the other's benefit." Baba Aliaun sat down slowly, absorbing this the way a man absorbs something that reorganizes several months of his own understanding of himself. "I owe you an apology I do not know how to give properly." He said it eventually, looking at Rokhaya. "I saw this marriage as the last thing I had to offer the village to prove my humility. I did not see it as your life." Rokhaya crossed the room and sat beside her father. "You were trying to save something. I understand that better now than I did on my wedding day." She took his hand. "It worked out. Not because of anything you did correctly, but it worked out." Baba Aliaun, who had spent 6 months absorbing one humiliation after another, allowed himself, for the first time since the collapse, something close to a genuine laugh, small, disbelieving, relieved. Fatou arrived uninvited an hour after Baba Aliaun left, having heard the news from 3 separate sources by the time she made it to the house, and greeted the entire situation with an enthusiasm that Rokhaya found, after the gravity of the previous conversations, almost restorative. "So he is actually one of the richest men in the region?" Fatou walked slowly through the front room as though seeing it for the first time. "And this house still looks like this?" "That is rather the point," Rokhaya said. Fatou considered the modest furniture, the stacks of books, the plain, clean lines of a house built for use rather than display. "I think I like him more now," Fatou said, "than I did when we thought he had nothing." "That is a strange thing to say." "It is not," Fatou said. "Anyone can be humble when they have nothing to be proud of. He had everything and chose this anyway." She looked at her sister. "That is a different kind of person entirely." Rokhaya's mother came the following day, alone, and her reaction was different from her husband's in a way that did not surprise Rokhaya at all. She did not ask about the money, or the company, or any of the practical details that had consumed Baba Aliaun's attention. She sat with Rokhaya in the kitchen, accepted a cup of tea, and asked only one question. "Does he make you laugh?" Rokhaya thought about it and found that the answer came easily. "Almost every day. In a way I do not think anyone else would even notice was a joke." Her mother nodded slowly, satisfied in a way that seemed to settle something she had been carrying since the wedding day. "Then none of the rest of it matters very much. I did not raise you to marry a fortune. I raised you to know a good man when the noise around him finally quieted down enough to hear him properly." She looked around the modest, orderly kitchen. "It sounds like the noise has quieted." Madame Sarr did not come to the house. Madame Sarr, in the days and weeks that followed, was notably and increasingly absent from the center of village conversation she had spent years carefully occupying. A development that required no intervention from Rokhaya or Thierno at all, because the village, once it understood who Thierno actually was, developed a rapid and thorough collective memory of every cruel thing Madame Sarr had said about him over 3 years, and found itself considerably less interested in her opinions on any subject going forward. Thierno did not seek any correction beyond what had already happened naturally. He did not publicize his wealth. He did not make any grand announcement or invite any reassessment of his standing beyond what the village worked out for itself. What he did do in the months that followed was quieter and more deliberate. The village well system, which had been inadequate for as long as anyone could remember, was expanded. New wells dug at 3 points around the village, properly lined, properly maintained, presented not as a gift from Theurnobald but simply arranged through the Regional Development Office in a way that made the source almost impossible to trace unless you already knew to look. The school, which had operated for years out of a building with a roof that failed reliably every rainy season, received a new roof, new desks, and 2 additional teachers whose salaries came from a fund that the village understood only as regional education support. Rokaya suggested most of it. Theurno funded all of it. Neither of them discussed it publicly, though the village, over time, developed its own quiet understanding of where the improvements were coming from, an understanding it mostly kept to itself out of something that might have been embarrassment, might have been gratitude, and was probably some complicated combination of both. 8 months after the wedding, on an evening when the rains had just cleared and the air carried that washed clarity that follows a storm, Rokaya sat with Theurno on the low bench outside the house, watching the light change over the fields. He shifted his weight slightly as he sat, the barely noticeable favor of one leg still there, still exactly as present as it had been on their wedding day, unchanged by anything that had happened since. She noticed him notice her notice it. I stopped seeing it after about the first week. I do not mean I stopped seeing you limp. I mean I stopped it meaning anything. It became just how you walk. The way some people walk quickly and some people walk slowly. It stopped being information about anything. He was quiet for a moment. That is exactly why I never corrected anyone. Not the village, not you, not the visitor at the market who nearly gave everything away months before I was ready. He looked at the fields. I did not want to be believed because I explained myself. I wanted to be known because someone paid enough attention to find out on their own, without being told what to look for. She leaned against his shoulder. They forced me to marry you. I want you to know I understand, now, that they were not the ones who actually decided anything. No, he agreed. That was always going to be up to us. At the edge of the village, where the road turned toward the regional town, a small sign had gone up some weeks earlier, unremarkable in size, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. It did not carry his name. It read only, Community Trust, Wells, Education, Roads. Nobody who passed it needed to be told who had put it there. But nobody needed to be told loudly either, and that, Rokaya had come to understand, was exactly how her husband preferred it. A man who had spent 3 years letting the village underestimate him completely, and who had discovered, in the end, that there was a particular kind of freedom in being loved by someone who had chosen him before she ever knew what he had, and who would have chosen him regardless.